They had been tramping for days beneath a leaden European sky when the order arrived, surrender. For German troops who had come through the inferno of battle, that command meant more than the end of fighting. It tore apart the lessons they'd been drilled on: honor, endurance, and loyalty to the Reich. Many were scarcely men, clutching worn boots and threadbare coats. Others were veterans who had already seen too much at Stalingrad, in Normandy, or amid the ruins of their own towns. As Allied trucks and trains filled with prisoners rumbled west, quiet guesses passed from man to man, England, or some camp in France, until the shock came. They would not remain in Europe, but be loaded onto vast ships bound for the Atlantic crossing. The voyage itself disoriented them. Packed into troop transports built for uniformed soldiers rather than detainees, they breathed damp air tinged with salt and engine oil. Yet for many there was an odd relief. The war for them had ended. There would be no more shells, no more frantic stands. Still they murmured about what America might hold. Years of official propaganda had painted the United States as a realm of ruthless capitalists, where workers suffered and enemies were treated cruelly. Some feared torture or execution. Others imagined hunger and backbreaking toil. As the Atlantic wore on under the watch of American sailors, small details unsettled those expectations. Rations were controlled, but compared with the famines of the war's final months, food felt generous. Soft bread, pats of butter on metal trays, coffee poured into stout mugs. The guards were firm but not vicious, more casually indifferent than openly hostile. They were not the monsters of leaflets and broadcasts, but young men themselves, swapping jokes and sometimes offering cigarettes without thinking. Days blurred and the prisoner's mood shifted. Fear lingered, but curiosity crept in. What kind of country was this, where provisions seemed plentiful even in wartime, and guards carried themselves with a calm assurance? Older men recalled stories of America's interwar wealth, jazz, Hollywood, skyscrapers, automobiles. But those had been distant pictures. Now they faced the reality, still wrapped in uncertainty. When the ships finally neared the American coast, many saw for the first time a shore so far from Europe, port skylines rising from the mist, cranes and factories, a constant bustle. For men who had left German towns still smoking with rubble, the scene was overwhelming. They expected to find destruction or poverty here too, and instead encountered vitality, industry, and a sense of power that suggested the war had touched this land differently. Disembarkation was brisk and precise. Under the eyes of American MPs, German soldiers filed down gangplanks and onto trains bound inland. The landscape flashing past, wide fields, tidy towns, billboards hawking unfamiliar goods, did not match the bleak images of America they had been fed. In low voices they named the differences, and as dread of deliberate cruelty eased, it was replaced by an uneasy awareness of their own ignorance. It was during those first days of custody and transport that the men began to suspect that captivity in America might not be the savage punishment they'd imagined. They could not yet foresee that some of the most surprising discoveries would be ordinary comforts, an endless supply of cigarettes and a strange sweet chew called gum. These small indulgences would come to stand for an alien abundance they would never forget. Their earliest impressions of America were formed before they entered any camp. Traveling inland, they passed busy stations where civilians went about everyday tasks with a calm that seemed impossible to those who had lived under constant bombardment. From train windows, they watched children eating ice cream, shop windows overflowing with goods and cars gleaming in sunlight. For men from cities hollowed by air raids and ration cards that allowed only scraps, it felt as if they had arrived on another planet. Arrival at the camps proved less terrifying than many had feared. Enclosed by barbed wire and overseen by watchtowers, the compounds looked secure but not cruel. Rows of wooden barracks stretched out in tidy lines resembling a small village. Bunks were plain but solid, and each man received a mattress, a blanket, and a bit of personal space. Compared with the chaos of the front, the conditions seemed oddly civilized. American discipline was strict but not fueled by hatred. Rules were enforced with authority rather than sadistic pleasure, which puzzled prisoners who had expected humiliation or worse. Food became the first major revelation. In the mess halls, they queued with trays and were given portions that seemed almost lavish: potatoes and meat, fresh white bread, vegetables tasting as if they had come straight from farms. For men accustomed to thin soups, ersatz coffee, and dry crusts, these meals exceeded anything they had known in years. Many realized they were being fed better in captivity than their families might be back home. And that contradiction brought sharp guilt as thoughts turned to hungry mothers and siblings. The guards themselves deepened the dissonance. They did not match the sadistic caricatures of enemy propaganda. Instead, they moved with an easy confidence, some being farmers' sons from Iowa, others factory hands from Ohio, and all sharing a casual ease with abundance. They smoked, laughed, and showed little interest in tormenting captives. The gulf between victor and vanquished was clear, but it was not poisoned by cruelty, a reality that often seemed almost unbelievable to the prisoners. In those opening days, they grew aware of the rhythm of American life even behind the wire. Cigarettes appeared constantly in the hands of guards and camp workers, the sharp, sweet scent of tobacco drifting through the air and clinging to uniforms. Bundles moved between fingers as casually as loose change. For German soldiers who had gone weeks with a few scraps of tobacco, the sight was staggering. It suggested a place where such treats were not rare treasures but ordinary as bread. Equally puzzling were the camp canteens and tiny shops where men could spend the small wages earned from labor. Cigarettes lined the shelves in neat rows, and alongside them appeared an unfamiliar item: cheerfully wrapped sticks of chewing gum. Few of the prisoners had ever encountered gum. Word spread fast through the barracks. The Americans kept chewing this sweet, rubbery stuff, blowing bubbles and clacking their jaws. Some mocked, some laughed, but curiosity took hold. What was this odd habit, and why was it so commonplace here? As time wore on, fear softened into fascination. The captives had expected punishment, but found themselves surrounded by reminders of a society so materially rich that even those held in custody enjoyed comforts many free Europeans lacked. Cigarettes and gum, trivial in themselves, stood out as emblems of that plenty, soon becoming obsessions and tokens of a civilization that had endured a world war without collapsing into want. It began with an unremarkable gesture. A guard propped against a barracks wall tapped a cigarette from its pack, struck a match on his boot, and lit it. The nearby German men could not help staring. They had smoked when they could, but the casual way the American handled the smoke was disconcerting. He drew slowly, savored it, and flicked the butt away half-finished. To men who had hoarded every scrap of tobacco, rolled half-burned ends, and traded crumpled papers for a single smoke, that careless toss seemed almost obscene. Then the scale of supply became undeniable. Cartons arrived by the truckload, filling storerooms and guard shacks, familiar American brands in bright wrappers. Cigarettes flowed without end. Guards handed them out as part of rations, and often simply offered them like small favors. At first the Germans suspected a ploy, a softening before some harsher measure, but the stream never slackened. Day after day, week after week, cigarettes kept appearing as reliably as bread and coffee. For many, smoking grew into more than a habit. It became a ritual, a means of reclaiming dignity amid confinement. Lighting a cigarette after labor gave a fleeting sense of normalcy. Smoke eased conversations and friendships formed in the thin haze above bunks. Men who had never smoked before found themselves drawn in, unable to resist something once scarce but now seemingly endless. The shared act of lighting up bound together men who had marched under banners of conquest and now were reduced to numbers behind wire. The abundance reshaped camp life into a mini-economy. Cigarettes turned into currency almost overnight. A few smokes could buy extra bread, a favor with washing, or protection from bullies. Packs became more useful than coins, which had little value in that setting. The Americans watched the small marketplace with amused detachment. For the Germans, it was both a means of survival and a glimpse into the American habit of commodifying everything. What unsettled the prisoners most was the ease with which Americans parted with cigarettes. Guards smoked constantly, their fingers stained, laughter punctuated by thin clouds of smoke. They offered smokes to one another and to prisoners with a casual generosity that baffled men who had once carefully rationed scraps of tobacco. Where tobacco had been hoarded like treasure, here it was given away as part of daily life. Cigarettes were not trophies of victory so much as banal provisions, and that contrast forced many to rethink the stories they'd been taught about America. In the long stretches of camp routine, as smoke curled toward the rafters, the question remained, if the enemy could spare such luxuries for captives, what did that reveal about the nation's wealth and strength? Over time, the endless cigarettes came to represent something deeper than indulgence, a vast economy that could afford to hand out comforts even to foes. For men still marked by scarcity and hunger back home, the sight was both soothing and disquieting. If packs of smokes amazed them, chewing gum bewildered by its novelty. The concept was alien to many. They had known hard candies and mints, but never a chewy, pliant substance that both softened and endured. The first time a guard unwrapped a bright stick and began to chew, the prisoners exchanged puzzled looks. Was it food, medicine, or some American eccentricity meant to mock them? A few timid men accepted pieces when offered, bracing for an unpleasant taste. Instead, they found sharp mint or fruity sweetness that lingered. The real astonishment came when the gum did not vanish. It softened, the flavor faded somewhat, but it remained chewable for hours. To men accustomed to swallowing sustenance as fuel, an item meant for prolonged, purposeless enjoyment made little sense. Rumors raced through the huts. Some claimed it was rubber. Others argued it had medicinal benefits. A few suspected it was intended to distract and dull them. For most, though, it became an absorbing curiosity. They watched guards chew obsessively while walking, talking, or standing watch, the click of jaws, the pop of bubbles, both comic and mesmerizing. When canteens began selling gum, demand exploded. Prisoners spent their small wages from camp work on the colorful sticks, treating them like contraband. A single piece could fetch favors or be coveted and chewed slowly to keep it lasting. Many kept the wrappers as keepsakes, marveling at the bright designs, bold typography, and cheerful slogans, trinkets from another world compared with the gray, utilitarian packaging back home. For those tasting gum for the first time, the experience carried psychological weight beyond flavor. It suggested a society so prosperous and confident it could produce items with no survival function, created solely for pleasure and disposal. At home, families rationed bread and potatoes, children scavenged in bombed streets. In America, people could afford to spend resources on something designed simply to be chewed and discarded. To the men behind the wire, that little luxury inspired both envy and unease, an ongoing reminder of the ruin awaiting back home. Chewing gum became oddly a way to cross cultural lines. Some prisoners picked it up at once, copying the Americans, learning to blow bubbles and laughing when they burst. Others refused, seeing it as childish or humiliating, a sign of surrender. Even those who scorned it could not escape the larger fact. America had more than enough. It could indulge its soldiers, its guards, even those it held captive. Gum, like cigarettes, was not propaganda nor a weapon, but a mundane pleasure that nevertheless revealed a great deal about the society they now peered into from a distance. Small and trivial, it nonetheless left a lasting impression and changed how many men pictured the world beyond their shattered towns. By the time the astonishment over tobacco and gum smoothed into habit, camp life had settled into a steady beat. Mornings began with guards calling the roll beneath stark watchtowers. The prisoners formed lines, answered in tired voices, and then dispersed to appointed duties. Some were sent beyond the wire to work fields, harvest crops, or tend animals for nearby farms. Others were put in workshops fixing tools or making furniture, and a few did construction for which small sums were credited to camp accounts. Through those earnings, cigarettes and gum moved from symbols of plenty into practical tools for getting by. The canteens stocked them alongside soap, sweets, and other small necessities. And each man quickly learned that participating in this economy made camp life more bearable. A pack of cigarettes might be traded for an extra blanket. a stick of gum for a polished pair of boots, a carton for someone else's week of chores. The Americans let these transactions proceed, perhaps because they kept order by giving prisoners little goals to pursue. Inside the barracks, a barter culture emerged that mirrored broader society. Cigarettes became a stable currency, and men who conserved them gained sway, while those who squandered them grew dependent. Gum, though less useful, carried its own mystique. Offered at the right moment, it could ease a quarrel, cement a friendship, or buy someone's loyalty. In cramped confinement, such small exchanges mattered. From the outside, the Americans often watched the makeshift market with amusement. Guards sometimes tossed packs into a crowd just to see the scramble, half entertained by the spectacle. But for the prisoners, the items represented more than diversion. They were tangible proof of American capacity. Even in a global war that sent forces across oceans, the nation could afford luxuries for both its people and its enemies. That reality gnawed at German pride far more effectively than insults or punishment ever could. Routine sharpened the contrast. Mornings filled with steaming tin mugs of coffee, lunches that included meat, vegetables, and bread so white it seemed extravagant compared to the coarse rye of home. Work breaks were spent smoking, chewing, and trading stories of families. Evenings brought censored letters that nonetheless served as lifelines. Through these rituals, cigarettes and gum offered not only comfort but structure, small anchors in long hours of waiting. Gradually, the prisoners adjusted. They decorated barracks with drawings, planted tiny gardens, fashioned games from scraps. Cigarettes became stakes in poker hands or bets on soccer matches in the yard. Gum wrappers were folded into tiny trinkets and kept as souvenirs. In a life stripped of freedom, such rituals supplied purpose. The plentifulness of these trivial goods deepened anxieties about what awaited at home. Men pictured their families in devastated German cities, scavenging for crumbs while they, locked away, enjoyed what felt like luxuries. The dissonance pressed on them, sparking hushed debates. Was this captivity an insult or a strange mercy? Whatever the answer, cigarettes and gum remained. Constant reminders that they were living inside a world not ruined by war. As weeks bled into months, the prisoners grasped the scale of the cultural gulf between their country and the America that surrounded them. It was more than barbed wire and uniforms. It was a profound difference in living standards, assumptions, and everyday comforts. Cigarettes and gum had hinted at this, but the longer they watched, the deeper their unease grew. They exchanged recollections of bitter wartime winters, families huddled in cellars dividing a crust of bread into almost invisible portions, mothers boiling weeds for soup while children sifted through rubble for anything edible. In Germany, tobacco had become a rarity reserved for officers or the black market. Soldiers often smoked dried scraps rolled into paper and coughed at the taste. Here, in contrast, guards tossed away half-burned cigarettes as if they were worthless, a sight that added to the prisoners' humiliation. They had marched and fought under banners promising German supremacy, repeatedly told their nation was the most advanced and disciplined on earth. Now they sat behind wire watching a society that appeared richer, freer, and more self-assured than anything they had known. Chewing gum crystallized that truth, an unnecessary non-functional product consumed by millions for pleasure alone, a mockery of scarcity. Discussions returned to propaganda, posters and speeches that had described America as corrupt and decayed. But how could such claims square with overflowing camp stores, fresh food, and an unending stream of cigarettes? Some argued it was a show put on for prisoners. Others admitted the evidence was plain and the Reich had lied. For younger soldiers, the cultural shock cut on a personal level. They observed American guards in clean uniforms, easy smiles, and pockets jingling with coins spent on candy and soda from vending machines. They watched those same guards write letters home, confident their families lived in houses spared from bombing, surrounded by functioning shops and schools. For those confined behind the wire, even something as small as a piece of chewing gum carried a weight far heavier than its size suggested. To many, it was a luxury that provoked both envy and unease, a sweet reminder that their homeland had been reduced to rubble, while here, even in captivity, abundance seemed effortless. Gum itself became an unlikely cultural link. Some prisoners embraced it eagerly, copying the Americans by chewing noisily or trying to blow bubbles, laughing when the sticky film collapsed over their noses. Others rejected it, insisting it was beneath their dignity, a childish habit, or worse, a humiliating reminder of defeat. Yet even the ones who disdained it could not dismiss the lesson it carried. America possessed so much wealth that it could afford to spoil not only its soldiers but also its guards and even its enemies. Like cigarettes, gum was not a weapon or a forced slogan, but an ordinary indulgence that revealed, more powerfully than speeches, how different life was in the country now holding them. Small, sweet, seemingly trivial, it nevertheless pressed itself into memory, changing how many prisoners imagined the world outside their ruined homeland. As time passed and the shock of gum and cigarettes wore off, the camp established its own rhythm. Dawn began with guards calling the men out to line up beneath the rigid silhouettes of watchtowers, their voices hoarse as they counted off before scattering to assigned work. Some were sent into the fields to harvest crops or tend cattle for nearby American farms. Others repaired tools in workshops, carved wooden benches, or joined construction crews where their labor earned small wages deposited in camp accounts. These credits turned gum and tobacco into more than just symbols. They became practical lifelines. The canteens brimmed with soap, sweets, toiletries, and other goods, and prisoners quickly learned that to endure confinement, they had to take part in this miniature economy. A pack of cigarettes could secure an extra blanket, a stick of gum could pay for a boot polish, and an entire carton might cover a week's worth of another man's labor. The Americans allowed these trades to flourish, perhaps recognizing that they gave men a sense of purpose, and kept order without constant enforcement. Within the barracks, bartering grew into a society in miniature. Cigarettes emerged as the true currency, dependable and universally valued. Men who saved them gained influence and security, while those who wasted them found themselves relying on others. Gum, though less essential, carried a different power. Offered in the right moment, it could seal a friendship, soften resentment, or purchase loyalty. In the cramped world of confinement, even the smallest gestures gained weight. The guards, watching from outside, often looked amused by this improvised marketplace. Some even tossed packs of cigarettes into crowds to spark a scramble, half amusement and half generosity. For the prisoners, though, these items went beyond entertainment. They were proof of America's extraordinary resources. Even while waging a global war, the United States could still lavish luxuries on its people and extend them even to its enemies. That reality pierced German pride more sharply than insults or punishments ever could. The contrast became sharper with daily routines. Mornings brought steaming mugs of coffee whose aroma filled the barracks, followed by lunches of meat, vegetables, and bread, so white and soft it seemed decadent compared to the dark, coarse loaves of rye from home. Work ended with pauses where men sat smoking, chewing, or speaking quietly of their families. Evenings arrived with censored letters from loved ones that, despite their blacked-out lines, were treasured lifelines. Cigarettes and gum provided not just comfort, but a rhythm that helped prisoners measure out the endless waiting. Slowly, the men adjusted. They decorated bunks with sketches, tended small gardens outside, improvised games with makeshift equipment, and wagered with cigarettes in poker matches or soccer games. Gum wrappers were folded into tiny figures, traded as keepsakes, or saved as tokens of memory. These small rituals gave meaning to days stripped of freedom and made life inside more bearable. Yet the abundance of such trifles stirred unease. Many wondered what their families were enduring in devastated German cities while they, captives, sipped coffee and chewed sweets. They imagined children searching through ruins for scraps of food, mothers boiling weeds into thin soups, families shivering in cellars during bitter winters. The dissonance was hard to bear, sparking whispered debates in bunks at night. Was this captivity a humiliation or an unexpected form of mercy? Whatever the answer, gum and cigarettes remained persistent symbols that they were now inside a world that war had not broken. With the passage of months, the cultural gap between their homeland and the America surrounding them became clearer and more painful. It was not just the barbed wire and the guards' uniforms that defined the divide. It was the deep difference in how life was lived, in what people valued, and in what they considered ordinary. The stories prisoners told each other at night underlined this truth. One man recalled how his family divided a single piece of bread into portions so small they were barely visible. Another described his mother boiling weeds to feed her children, who scavenged through ruins for anything edible. Tobacco in Germany had become so scarce it was reserved for officers or traded on the black market, and many soldiers had smoked dried leaves wrapped in scraps of paper, coughing at the bitter smoke. Here, guards tossed aside half-finished cigarettes without a thought. The humiliation of the comparison was inescapable. They had been told again and again that Germany was the superior nation, disciplined, advanced, and destined to dominate. Yet here they sat, fenced in, observing a society that appeared richer, freer, and more secure than anything they had ever experienced. Chewing gum embodied this divide more than anything. Unnecessary, frivolous, yet consumed by millions with no hesitation. To the Germans, it seemed almost a mocking gesture of prosperity. The conversations often circled back to propaganda. Many remembered posters and speeches that had painted America as a crumbling society plagued by poverty and corruption. But how could those images be reconciled with the overflowing canteens, the constant supply of food, the endless stream of cigarettes and gum? Some clung to the idea that it was all a staged illusion, a performance designed to deceive. Others admitted the truth was too obvious to deny. The Reich had lied, and America was far stronger than they had been led to believe. For the younger soldiers, the shock carried a personal edge. They saw guards with crisp uniforms, relaxed expressions, and pockets heavy with coins they spent freely on soda and candy at vending machines. They watched them write letters home with calm assurance that their families were safe in intact houses, in neighborhoods where shops and schools still functioned without fear of air raids. Every glimpse reinforced the same conclusion. Beyond the wire lay a world of stability and wealth, a world unshaken by war, a world that challenged everything they had been told to believe. Such small details cut deeper than any lecture. They offered glimpses of a reality that stood in stark contrast to the smashed streets of Dresden or Hamburg. Even the simple act of chewing gum came to mark a difference. Americans chewed while on duty, while talking, while lounging in the sun. The steady snap and smack of gum became the background sound of captivity. Some Germans sneered at it as childish, while others envied the easy freedom it implied, to chew without care, to waste time and resources on something needless. That was a kind of power, proof of a nation so secure it could afford habits that seemed frivolous to those raised on scarcity. The more the prisoners observed, the clearer it became that being held in America was more than a pause until the war ended. It forced them to face an awkward truth. The world they were taught to loathe had outpaced them not only in weaponry, but in everyday life. Cigarettes and gum were not merely comforts. They were visible evidence of abundance, emblems of a culture that had prospered while theirs fell apart. When letters from home finally made their way into the camps, they offered another sharp contrast. Mail arrived irregularly, often late, and always censored. Each packet carried the faint, bitter smell of a war-ravaged Europe. Ink blurred, paper was fragile, handwriting tense. Families wrote in guarded phrases, knowing Allied censors would read every line. They mentioned health in vague terms and said they were surviving despite hardship. But between the careful words the prisoners read hunger, fear, and the slow fading of hope. Under guard, the men sat at rough tables and wrote back across the ocean, composing their replies with equal caution. Still, it was impossible to conceal everything. Some admitted they were fed far better than expected. Others hinted at the odd plenty around them while choosing phrasing that would not seem boastful. We are treated with decency, one might write. There is enough food and some small comforts. The real detail, endless cigarettes and gum as camp currency, remained largely unspoken, though it filtered into letters indirectly. A note about steadier nerves, improving health, or calmer spirits that owed as much to smoke and chewing as to any real peace. A few men were braver in their accounts, mentioning cigarettes even for prisoners, as if to tell families that captivity was survivable. The irony was bitter. Men behind barbed wire smoked freely while fathers and brothers at home burned newspaper twisted into makeshift cigarettes. Envy was rarely admitted in letters, since describing abundance could wound relatives living on ration cards and dodging raids. But among themselves, prisoners acknowledged the truth. Sometimes life in custody felt easier than life at home. Confessions traveled quietly through the huts. One man said he felt guilty chewing gum while picturing his wife dividing a single potato for their children. Another admitted he had smoked more in 1 week of captivity than in the whole previous year of fighting. These admissions spread like smoke toward the rafters. Allied censors barred anything touching military matters, but allowed accounts of daily life to pass. Perhaps intentionally, as a way to show German civilians their men were being treated humanely and to sow doubt about Nazi claims. Families who read of coffee, cigarettes, and gum could hardly avoid wondering what such details meant for the enemy's strength and for the wider world outside the Reich's shrinking borders. A strange duality settled over the prisoners, a continual ache for separated families and worry about their fate, coupled with the guilty awareness that they were in some respects better off than those at home. Cigarettes and gum, trifles, became symbols of that divide, constant reminders that American plenty reached even into internment while Germany starved. In every censored line and every careful phrase lay an unspoken fact. Captivity here was not merely endurance, but an exposure to a reality their homeland could no longer match. When the war ended and repatriation began, the men packed small bundles, clothes, letters, perhaps a book, but what weighed most were memories. They crossed the Atlantic again, uneasy and expectant, some desperate to embrace families, others dreading the ruined landscapes that awaited. Nearly all carried the same odd recollection, the image of cigarettes and chewing gum as persistent tokens of their time in America. Back home, the contrast was merciless. Cities lay in ruins, food queues snaked through streets, and homes were patched from bombed shells. Family reunions were wet with tears but shadowed by despair. The returning prisoners soon realized they could not openly recount tales of carton after carton of cigarettes or bright gum wrappers without sounding fantastical or, worse, disloyal. Still, among trusted friends, the stories slipped out. The guards who smoked without thought, the well-stocked stores, the men who had never gone hungry, and those listening beside empty cupboards found it almost unbelievable. For many former captives, the experience altered how they saw the world. They had arrived in America bracing for cruelty, and discovered instead a society overflowing with small luxuries even amid war. Cigarettes and gum became more than indulgences. They were lessons, proof of an economy unbroken by destruction and a culture confident enough to spare comforts for enemies. For men raised to believe in German supremacy, the revelation was humbling. Some carried those lessons into rebuilt lives. Years later, as West Germany recovered, ex-POWs would tell their children about the taste of American gum and the sight of guards flicking away cigarettes without a second thought, recalling how strange it was to chew endlessly or to smoke without rationing. For them, those moments summed up a larger truth. America had prevailed not solely through arms, but through abundance. Others recalled the psychological burden of such wealth. To be surrounded by plenty while knowing one's homeland starved was both soothing and shaming. It bred resentment in some, admiration in others, but it left a permanent impression. Cigarettes and gum became emblems of captivity and of a turning point, a confrontation with realities that had been denied by propaganda. In memoirs and oral histories, the theme recurs. Soldiers remembered not only lost battles and buried comrades, but the odd shock of being given too much in captivity. The careful letters home omitting details, the guilty pleasure of blowing bubbles, the absurd barter of cigarettes as money. Those memories lingered long after uniforms were laid aside and new lives began. Ultimately, the story of German prisoners held in America was not just one of defeat and survival, but of discovery. The never-ending cigarettes and the peculiar sweetness of gum revealed more than mere indulgence. They revealed a society functioning on a vastly different scale of prosperity. Though the men returned to their own soil, they carried the clear knowledge that they had glimpsed a future their country would need decades to rebuild. Cigarettes and gum, small and ordinary, had become the unexpected symbols of a fractured generation's confrontation.